Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today to talk a little bit about OSINT. I'm John TerBush, one of the co-authors of the Sec 587 Advanced OSINT course at SANS. And joining me today are my other co-authors, Nico Dekens.
Hi, everybody.
David Mashburn.
Good morning.
And our special guest for today is David Carver. David has worked doing open source intelligence and other, all source type collections work. And he's worked for FireEye. He works actually with me now at Recorded Future. And he's got a lot of experience on the analysis side, creating both collection side and as well doing assessments of information. And I think all of us here probably agree that doing the analytical part of OSINT is something that not always all the attention goes to, right? People get really focused on collection. How do I find this thing? How do I gather this information? But then once you have some data, what do you do with it? So that's what we'll be talking about today. I think we're going to have a lot of fun. First, David, why don't you, David Carver, we have two Davids here, so I'll have to specify. Mr. Carver, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
I was about to say, Mr. Carver is my dad's name. But yeah, so I started at, in terms of cyber threat intelligence, I started at iSIGHT Partners back in the day doing hacktivism research. Anecdotally, it's fascinating watching folks like Lapsus and Ransom House and other folks coming onto the scene, because I cut my teeth initially on folks like Rex Mundi, who were data extortion groups at the time, similar kind of smash and grab operations. And that involved quite a bit of investigation between not just kind of that level of skeevy kind of criminal group, but also people like Op Greenrights at the time, Op Red Hack, et cetera. So there was a lot of investigation into kind of general open source social media collection, but then also kind of more like off the beaten path chat investigations and other forms of infrastructure investigations. After that, when we were acquired by FireEye, I moved over to the information operations team. So that involved kind of a similar set of open source intelligence parameters with a direct focus increasingly over a couple of years on kind of info ops and disinformation, that type of thing. Then I moved over to Recorded Future in 2017, and based on the nature of the service that I was working with at the time, and still largely I'm working with now, much more of kind of a grab bag, jack of all trades set of open source requirements across criminal activity, nation state activity, hacktivist activity, general flaws, vulnerability coverage, et cetera. So I feel like I've touched a lot of different things over the last several years, none of which I'm going to say I'm an expert in, but happy to talk about sort of how I've gone about analyzing some of that stuff.
That's a pretty good spread, I think, there. I know Nico has done some work on information ops, so you guys probably have some similar ideas there, or have done some similar work, I think. Let's go ahead and talk some about analysis. Maybe let's start with biases, because I think this is a big area where, again, not a lot of attention goes into it, but we do have these situations where people go out and they're collecting and they have, a strong confirmation bias. They want to prove X, right? So how do we, sort of protect ourselves and our clients from these sort of skewed assessments?
Well, that's a good question.
I was going to say, Nico, you want to run with that one first?
Yeah, well, I think that bias is human nature. There's nothing we can do about it. Every human has a form of bias that they are aware of, or most of the time unaware of, I think. I think the important part is when it comes to intelligence analysis or open source intelligence analysis, that you should always be aware of the fact that you have those biases, that you will jump to conclusions based on how you were raised, what you know, what your religious background is, what your political preference is. And it's hard to keep that out of your investigations. This is why we have analytical models, for example, to help us and aid us to prevent us to stepping into those fall pits. And this is why I think it's always good to never act solo. If you do your investigations purely solo, there's no one that puts you to a halt and points out, let's say, a gap in your analysis, or an assumption that you made based upon the information that you collect, or that outcome that you want your investigation to have. So this is why I always encourage people to be, first of all, their own devil's advocate, but maybe reach out to someone that they trust or know, or even more important, someone that's not into the field itself, and let them proofread your work, and just simply not tell them anything. Just read my work and just tell me, what do you notice? What are things that raise questions to you? And that will help you detect those biases. That's something that I strongly believe in, that will help you move forward in becoming better and more aware of the biases that you may have. Don't know what your opinions may be, David Carver.
Yeah, I was going to say, number one, get ready for my hair to fall into my face for the next 45 minutes here, because it's been a while since I got that cut. But as kind of a fun metaphor there, analytic bias is very much like that. Like, you can do everything that you can to balance against it, but it's always going to be something that falls into your face. So you have to have good ways of dealing with it, working around it, etc. I think there are a number of different ways of mitigating for bias. I don't think there is ever a silver bullet for getting rid of it. And because of that, I think that you have to go into any investigation with the assumption that you're doing things wrong in some area or another, that you're trying to find something, or you're trying to assess something in an incorrect way. One of the other things that I'll bring up as perhaps maybe a little bit more tactical for how I like to approach certain investigations is, if you have a hypothesis in mind, be really strict with yourself on what you would need to find to support that hypothesis. So if, let's say, you're looking for, you have X assessment, and you say, well, this is what we would expect to find if, let's say, there was, going to be an uptick in this type of nation state activity, or if someone was going to try to exploit this vulnerability, you should have a really stringent set of requirements for, okay, this piece of evidence from this vetted source of evidence is what I'm going to need to be pretty confident about that. Because the flip side, which is really dangerous, is to say, okay, let me see what's out there about X. And then you find something that's really interesting or significant or striking for any number of reasons. Mm-hmm. And as we know, our brain will translate, oh, this is striking or significant in aspect A, therefore it's probably significant or striking in aspect B. So if, let's say, I find something that is really unique, or that's never been seen before, there's a bias for me to translate that into, and therefore this is really meaningful, or this really supports my case, right? That sense of extremity, that sense of really, is going to translate over, even if it doesn't really apply. So I think one of the most important key things when you're looking at analytic bias is, make sure that you're just setting yourself up correctly, right? I think Nico's really elucidated well the fact that when you already have some information, you want someone reactively looking over your shoulder and saying, hey, what does this look like? Proactively, you want to set up the investigation that you say, it's a little bit like, if I can use an analogy here, going to a casino and saying, okay, when I lose $25, I'm done, right? I'm going to stop. You set up your investigation in such a way that you say, okay, if I find X, then I'm in a good spot. If I don't find X, then no matter what other really interesting stuff I found, it doesn't apply, and I have to go with a different assessment. Mm-hmm. So that's how I'd recommend, like I said, very tactically starting off to correct for some bias that you might find in certain investigations.
So in a way, we're kind of talking about scoping a little bit here, right? We're making sure that we're focused on the important things. We're not going to try to ignore things, obviously, but we're going to try and make sure we understand what it is we actually need to collect.
Yes, I can give as an example there that just came off the top. Let's say that we're looking to see whether a set of threat actors is interested in compromising an organization, right? Or they're interested in compromising a specific entity. Well, as a result of that, one of the things that we would need to scope initially is evidence, like actual evidence of intent to target. And that evidence of intent to target is probably going to need some level of infrastructure, and then previous activity or malicious indicators or associations. What we might find in the course of that investigation is something like 50 to 100 type-a-squat domains that are all registered and all feature a really unique kind of string setup that relate to that organization. It's very easy for us looking at that to say, oh goodness, like I found 100 of these type-a-squats, therefore someone's planning something. No, I mean, someone could have just said, oh, I'm going to bank these and then I'm going to wait for the company to pay me, or I'm going to get ad click revenue, right? And looking at base rates, it's probably the latter, right? It's probably what is going to be more common rather than someone setting up a whole custom bespoke malicious campaign. So we have to be really careful, like I said, to not take something that is a really interesting factor and use it to translate into an inappropriate level of confirmation.
I have a question. So if this happens to you, how would you deal with such a quote unquote problem? So you found, let's say that those 100 type-a-squatted domains. What kind of maybe analytical models or techniques would you use to tackle that issue, to make sure that you don't have that bias, or you did a proper assessment of how trustworthy those sources are?
Sure. Like I said, the first thing that I would have already done by that point is scoping out what are the associations that I need to see for this to be true. But after that, let's say that I've stumbled on this big data set. Well, the first thing that I'm going to want to do is to take a look at that and say, okay, what are, like we found this general category, and this is kind of a good sort of general practice for analysis. You never want to move from one category tier all the way down to the category tier that you're really interested in, right? So if I see a whole bunch of type-a-squat domains, therefore there's some malicious activity that's being planned. Well, there's a bunch of missing middles in that. I don't want to jump down category to category. So a good analytic technique is understanding what are the levels of specification that have to occur to get from general category to more specific category. So for example, with domain abuse, I see a whole bunch of type-a-squat domains. I'm going to say the next category down that's going to determine is this more or less malicious is, okay, what are the network and infrastructure associations? So I'm going to be looking for any previous association for malicious DNS, IP address activity. I'm going to be looking for anything that's hosted on those domains, if anything, that indicates a certain level of intent. All right, so I've got that information. Now the next piece of information I'm going to say is, okay, based on either historical or current trends, what is the most likely aspect of those items that is going to translate into activity? So for example, if someone's just setting up a page and it looks like it's brand abuse, right? Like it's, hey, come here, for information on X organization. That's one thing. But if, very prominently on that page, there's a big old like login field or please enter your credentials field. Well, okay, that's a level of specificity that's a bit more relevant to threat activity because we know that people have used credential harvesting pages that emulate certain types of brands, specifically things like online platforms like Office 365 or Okta or whatever else. So as just, like I said, as a general rule, one analytic technique that I like to use is to say, let's never jump down levels of specificity until we've gone like kind of tier by tier category for what gets us closer and closer to the mark. And you can do that the opposite way too. You can say, okay, for me to be really confident about X campaign, let's avoid domain abuse for a second. Let's say the likelihood that a nation state is going to engage in certain types of activity. Well, I'd be looking for a certain set of indicators or historical campaigns. If I didn't find that, my next jump is not going to be, well, let me see what every nation state group is doing to get a sense of what they could be doing, right? Because that's such a big field at this point. I would be jumping up one tier to say, okay, what are other similar like APT groups linked to that same country? What are they doing, right? Jump up one tier, and then jump up another tier and say, okay, I could go in one of two directions. I could say, what are similar like regional groups doing? Or I could say, what are similar groups by resourcing doing? So you're always moving up one tier at a time or moving down one tier at a time. And I feel like even just by doing that, even if it doesn't get you really good information, just forcing your mind into that model often forces you to ask questions about how you're looking at the data that will bring you to a better sense of assessment.
So raising questions is basically the key to success in most cases. So you find a piece of information, and now what? What does this piece of information mean? Who placed this piece of information online? Why was it placed online? When? With what means? With what intent? Those kind of things. And something that I think, and correct me if you don't agree, when it comes to open source intelligence, for me, it can be very challenging if you find a piece of information to find confirmation through at least one or two other sources, not being the initial source, to get that confidence level go up, for example. Would that something that you would encourage people to do, maybe with making use of certain analytical models like ACH or the analysts competing hypothesis or something like that, just to point out, hey, I know something that creates a hypothesis based upon what I found. Now let's try and stress that piece of information.
Yeah, I think that's it's a good model. One thing that I've discovered in the past about ACH is that it can be a tremendously nuanced and difficult model to put together, particularly depending on the type of hypothesis that you have. And part of that is, especially I've seen this for certain elements of attribution, which I think it tends to get used there the most often, but I don't know that that's necessarily the most helpful place to start for ACH. Is there are certain hypotheses where there are so many potentially correct answers for which, based on the data you have, it doesn't really fill in or weight any one of those above any of the others because they apply equally well. You know, if we're talking about APT activity, we're in an environment now where so many groups use the same tools or do the same things once they're on a system or are looking for the same level of access. So we have a huge set of indicators that doesn't really push anyone to the surface in an easy way. I like ACH and similar, like, let's really step back and spreadsheet this out or whatever. I love those models for the more smoking gun, the evidence you feel like you have, or the more striking the assessment that you think you have. This is, again, very, very tactical, but anytime I find something in the course of intelligence or research that makes me smile, my gut instinct is frown right now, because you are more likely to take things seriously and see it in the proper context if you are keeping some distance from it. If you see yourself as like in league with that piece of information or indicator in pursuit of something, you've essentially set up a friendship that shouldn't exist with information. That means you're going to be a friend to the information more than a friend to a correct assessment. So you got to think about that a little bit more carefully too. Is that kind of good context or response there, Nico?
Yeah, absolutely. But hearing you talk, you basically also say that ACH is not always suitable for what we do within open source intelligence, or at least that's how I understand your reply to me.
Yes, and the
Would
reason
you?
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Would you say that there are, let's say, alternative known techniques that may work better, or well, not necessarily may work better, but that you should also use to maybe see if you overlooked something with making use of ACH only?
That's a good question. I think there's sort of a larger set of inductive and deductive reasoning principles that probably work here. ACH is the purpose is to say there are multiple hypotheses that we need to weight differently because there's too little information or intelligence to make an easy single application easy, right? But the areas where a single application would be easier, I think is simply a matter of saying, first of all, is there a deductive reasoning component that works here? Is it possible to have X number of pieces of information or X single piece of information that will always inevitably lead to this assessment? Like, let's figure that out. I think part of, especially for so much of the work that happens in the cyber threat space, there are so many different categories of information and so many different categories of research that we do that, in some sense, again, going back to scoping, one of the more important things you can do in terms of analytic technique is to say, like, within my field or within this type of investigation, what do certain indicators actually mean? And that's that difference between research and analysis that we were talking about before we jumped on, is a researcher is going to be able to find all this really interesting information. The analyst is going to say, before we do anything else, before we try to say, what the priority is here or where we think that this leads, we need to sit down and say X piece of information leads to X assessment, right? So for example, it can be as nuts and bolts as, is certain infrastructure set up? Yes, no, right? That's something that, assuming that we are looking at data in the right way or we have the right sourcing, we can answer that question. But there are other analytic techniques where you might not have it be that clear cut. And then you'd have to say, okay, assuming that there's not an immediate A to B answer, what at least is like an A through C leads to whatever this is answer. So I realize that's fairly vague, but like I said, one of the issues, especially in the cyber threat intel space, is because we're looking at, there's the sort of bread and butter stuff that we can always take a look at, like certain types of infrastructure, passive DNS, hosting, and then information that's stored in different areas of the open networked internet, like dark web sourcing, forums, marketplaces, social media, open media, blogs, etc. There's so much of that out there that you need to have defined what I need to find and what it means previously. And then, of course, it's probably a good idea as an analytic technique to say, has anyone ever botched this before? So if you're, for example, looking for like military movements or troop movements or something to do with like geopolitical exercises, I'd say look for the areas where it got botched worst in the past. So, of course, the classic example for anything geopolitical is going to be 2003, right? Are there weapons of mass destruction in this area? Look at what were the biases or the areas that went wrong there. And I would say too, if you're being humble, you probably don't need to go too far afield to figure out areas where like you've got it wrong yourself. So say, okay, I flubbed this one for this specific type of analysis. One analytic technique is to keep an analytic library of mistakes and to say, okay, I got this wrong. Why did I get this wrong? Or even to be honest with yourself too and say, okay, I forecasted X. I said there was X chance of something. It didn't happen. That doesn't mean I was wrong. It just means the percentage that I forecasted, that's the one that hit. Did I look at that in a different way? So that's a little bit of a shotgun response, but that's kind of some of the things that have come to mind there.
Yeah, that literally reminded me of what I actually teach students in class, saying that not finding an answer is an answer too. The lack of information by itself could also be an outcome of your overall intelligence, where maybe your team leader can take action upon. Because if you're trying to identify, let's say, a certain suspect and you expect them to be, for example, where I'm now in Amsterdam, and you found no evidence, but beforehand, everybody told you, hey, they spend all their life there. There should be some evidence somewhere in the open source intelligence sphere, but you found nothing. So maybe this person did a very good job, operation security wise, to hide on the internet. And that by itself could be interesting. This also, I think that's where we started off, that we are talking about open source intelligence, where people who start out in open source intelligence stick to the OS part and forget the INT part. We are generating actionable intelligence based upon a question. And I think that's something that's overlooked just because people are so eager. Oh, there's so much data out there. Give me everything. But now what? I have a bunch of information. What does that mean? What answer are we looking for? And that, again, you told, everything starts with a good question, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I had a thought there and I completely missed it. So I'm going to let one of the other folks here jump in.
I think David Mashburn has a question. I did want to point out first, this is a live stream. If anyone wants to drop some questions into the ongoing comments, we'll try to address some of those. So, for those that have joined us, please do participate. Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, so while you're thinking of your kind of pulling together your thoughts here, and so one of the techniques that we've been exploring a lot more is kind of the use of visualization to help us. Do you make a lot of use of that during your analytical process? Is there anything you can share along those lines?
Visualization, I think, works really well when you are working with what I'd call networked data. So in particular, when you're looking at, the internet is a great place for this because there's so much that's networked in different ways, whether it's networked across the IP space or the protocol space or whatever. But I haven't engaged in this in a little bit, but back in the day, I would have done quite a bit too with networking across groups, right? So groups of individuals, groups of actors, and having kind of a visual sense of like, what is this username associated with? Like, what are the different areas that it's present? What are the different interests or intents or text strings, whatever they're associated with this? And then can I link this to infrastructure? Can I say that this is a registrant for however many number of other domains? Does it show up in X capacity, et cetera? So I think visualizations or like mind mapping, any of those types of things, that can be very good. And the reason I say it can be very good is, again, it kind of depends on what you're doing. And this is probably going to be the drum I'll beat for the rest of this talk. I suspect that in a lot of cases, the format that slowing down for the information takes is not as important as the fact that you are slowing down to look at the information. So if putting together a visualization is what helps you to take 30 minutes to a couple of hours to say, okay, what's the information I have? How does it work together? As opposed to you just like starting to write something up and saying, well, I found X, therefore it means this. Like anything that slows your brain down is going to make you a better analyst. So whether that's a visualization, whether that's ACH, whether that's, any other form of like tactics or certain types of reasoning, it's almost certainly going to make you a better analyst.
Cool. Yeah, I look at it from the perspective of being recently influenced by some stuff I read saying, how accurately your visualization reflects your data is really such an important part of that. And that sounds like it really plays into your idea of kind of stepping back and slowing down and really being able to validate your findings.
Yep.
Yeah.
Speaking of visualization, oh, sorry, Nico.
No, go ahead, John.
Someone brought the question up about tools, Tableau versus Spotfire in this example for visualization. My perspective on it is everyone kind of has their own perspective on what tool, especially something like visualization, right? We're all different. We all see things and kind of understand things differently. I wouldn't even try and sit here and tell you which is better because I don't know what kind of work you do. I don't know, the mass of networking nodes that you need to look at or whatever. I would say really whatever works for you works for you. I try not to be prescriptive too much with tooling.
Yeah, and do not forget tools have a learning curve.
Yeah. I mean, even simple tools like Excel it really depends on the type of data you have. Whatever you have options to do visualizations. Just again, I think the visualization should focus on the data and the story it's telling, not on the decoration there, right? I mean, everybody loves a pretty graph or something else, but think about what it is you're trying to represent. That's as David Carver mentioned, it's not really going to necessarily apply in every case. And so kind of along those lines as well, as we kind of think about representations of data such as visualizations, kind of moving into talk about larger data sets. Do you do much in the way of automated analysis of data, trying to find patterns in there, kind of looking at that from that graph perspective? Or is it still much of your analytic process driven on kind of manual connections and trying to kind of work through those tiers as you describe them?
So I'm a little bit, this is anecdotal. I'm sure that there are people who are similar to me on this call, but anecdotally, there are people who look at a spreadsheet of like thousands of different data points and their eyes glaze over. I love that stuff. Like I love taking like a spreadsheet and just like skimming through and letting my eye see whether there are patterns that are showing up. And I'd say one of the best things that you can do if you've got like a big old data set is take at least just like 15, 20 minutes on your own and go through it manually. Just like go through it and say, what are some of the stuff, like things that I'm seeing that if I was setting it up for a specific form of automation, here's a good example might be, let's say that I've got a whole bunch of like chat logs from somebody and I'm looking through for certain text strings or I'm looking through for certain ways that they talk about a topic. Okay, that's interesting. But me setting up, let's say I just put together a quick and dirty Python script that's going to say, okay, if you find X string, bring me back that log. Or if you find like, X set of strings across a number of different parameters or permutations, bring that back. Well, what you've just done is yes, you've brought back the most relevant data for those text strings that you can find. What you have not done is bring back all of the most relevant data for that topic, because there's almost certainly a way of talking about whatever you're looking for that doesn't always immediately say this text string or this word. So having a sense of how somebody is talking about different things, or how they engage with others, or how they might be euphemistic in the way that they talk about certain things, that's really, really important when you're thinking about how to automate. I love automation for non-reducible indicators. So it's like, okay, I just need to find reference to, let's say, this very specific, word or entity, and the chances that anybody is going to talk about it or have used it in a different way is nil because of the information that comes through using it that way. Great, non-reducible. But if there's any way of talking around something, or if there's any nuance that's possible in getting information about something, be really careful about automation, because yes, you'll get some good stuff back, but there's probably as much that you're leaving on the cutting room floor.
So I guess you maybe to restate slightly. So we're talking about a gap here really is on the semantic analysis or the contextual analysis of that versus just straight keyword type of, quick and dirty type of analysis.
Yeah.
I love the idea.
Sorry.
I was going to say, I love the idea of, before you jump into that automation, have a strong kind of manual look at things. Like something I used to like to do when I was detecting, malicious traffic when I was working in the SOC, was just scan through URLs. And I just developed a feel for like, okay, that's weird. What's that? Mm-hmm. And then once you kind of honed in on that manually, you could maybe create regular expressions, regex to kind of pull that data out and go automation, right? But it really helps to sort of really get a feel for things first, in my opinion.
It could also be a topic, right? Because I remember vividly when I was in law enforcement, when we were tasked to examine youth gangs, for example, where we had internal information that, based upon the link analysis, made it appear like that certain individuals were key players in that group. And then we used open source intelligence information coming from mostly social media to see how they interacted on social media with each other. And that totally changed the outcome, because now all of a sudden the person who was assumed to be the most active key player had no importance or no leading or steering role within that particular group. Again, this for me made me aware of the fact that, hey, I jumped to conclusions. I assumed based upon the initial information that was the outcome that we were looking for. That's the leader of the group. We need to catch that guy. He's pulling all the strings. But they're looking at additional data, taking the time to maybe look at how the group communicated, and not looking anymore for who communicates the most, but now flipping it around, who communicates the least within the group. And then coming to the understanding, hey, maybe the people who say less are the more important ones, because they really need less words to let the other people, the foot soldiers, do the dirty work for them. That's something that's not CTI related, but is that something that you would look for as well? If you find a certain outcome and you are almost certain that has to be the outcome, that you try to throw it around 180 degrees and see, hey, what if it's totally the other way around?
Sort of a devil's advocate process.
Yeah, again, yeah.
Yeah, devil's advocate is great. It's it can be as simple as, hey, what if you're wrong? That's a fun question. But it can be as specific as, okay, what piece of information would most cause you to doubt your hypothesis? And when people start thinking about it that way, then, even if they're wrong about it, at least they're entertaining the possibility that there's a level of analysis that they might have missed because they were so excited about the data they have right now.
Mm-hmm.
But it also ties kind of into understanding maybe different cultures a little bit. For example, if I'm doing investigation into a part that's not close to me, maybe for me that would be things that are related to Asia. I don't understand the language. I don't know many people in my personal life that can tell me something about what's normal in that culture. And if I find information, and for me that may be super strange if I find a piece of information, but in that culture, it's pretty normal that people act or react in that way. Is that something that you would encourage people who start out in open source intelligence to maybe do their homework on the subject matter itself before actually diving into the investigation?
Always, yes. I think you bring up a really good point about kind of cultural differences, because the exact same indicator or piece of evidence can mean vastly different things within one cultural or regional or geographical context than it does in another. So, for example, several years ago, when the hacktivist boys were just, smashing and grabbing as much as they could, you had two extraordinarily different groups on the scene at the same time. So you had Anonymous BR, which is the big Brazilian kind of anonymous crew, and then you had 1937 CN, which was at that point the most significant Chinese hacktivist crew. And an Anonymous BR announcement of, hey, we breached whatever organization, that could have been what they did after breakfast, because they were just going after everybody at that time. 1937 CN comes out and says, hey, we breached X organization. That's a big deal because they were not as prolific. And when they did hit stuff, it was usually in the service of a really we are only going after, a certain regional item for a certain message that we're trying to spread related to something we're angry about in Chinese geopolitics. And that's not to say that same level of application or message can't be true across both of those groups, but you really need to understand what activity looks like and what it means to the folks conducting that activity before you can compare them, or before you can say what's the relevance one way or the other. So yes, absolutely. And to that point, I'd say and this is kind of another drum that I like to beat, stay as humble as possible when you're running open source intelligence. If you think you don't know about something, get that off your plate immediately and ask somebody else who does. Never assume that you're going to spin yourself up enough within 2 to 4 hours on the nuanced implications of regional or cultural items. Talk to somebody who knows first, because it can be as simple as a single sentence from that individual to say, oh goodness, I'm looking at this in the wrong way.
Yeah, totally agree. Absolutely.
So when else might you feel like, you know what, I need to bring someone else in to look at this? When are those times? And especially looking at you're newer to this, right? You're sort of a junior analyst. You've just sort of started getting your hands dirty in this kind of work. When might be good times for you to say, I need to step back here and maybe have some other eyes look at this?
I'll take that briefly. I think we've kind of already talked about this in a certain context, but anything that you see as a smoking gun for any reason, that's a great idea to send to somebody else without any context, right? Just send it to someone who's more senior and say, hey, what does this mean to you? Because if they look at it and they're like, oh, okay, I guess that's interesting, right? It probably means something different based on experience than it does to you. So really good to have a completely unbiased and unfiltered approach to evidence that you think is interesting from somebody else. That's a great time to bring in another pair of eyes. Yeah.
Yeah, and John, I mean, in similar experience, we've done very sensitive investigations internally, things that were driven by subpoenas and from law enforcement, and the process I work gave the same piece of evidence to two different people, let them work independently, and then only then would we necessarily come up to like a named individual, because we're trying to make sure there is no, hey, I found this, do you see this, kind of getting away from that bias that may come into play when I feed you something and tell you the expected outcome. And that kind of loops back to the earlier conversations about, making sure we're setting it up so what question are we asking really becomes so important.
And that's that team A, team B kind of process, which can also be very effective.
Yeah, absolutely. So another question that I think we can address here. So if you write a report, A lot of people who start out in open source intelligence simply collect the data, and they come to a certain outcome and a conclusion, and 9 out of 10 times that's just a screenshot with a comment saying, hey, here's the evidence. How would you encourage people who start out in open source intelligence to address those important topics and basically show the evidence in a final report? Because I still think that that's the most important part of your entire open source intelligence analysis. That's the final outcome, your report. That's the deliverable to your client. What should be in there and what should not be in there when it comes to the analytical process as well as the biases?
From the analytical processes perspective, I don't think that you can do better as just like a starting fundamental template than basic syllogistic logic. And I don't mean that necessarily it's going to translate all the way through, but let's say that you come and you say, hey, I have evidence that this organization is, let's say, selling a particular malware that targets a very particular set of technologies. And then you have a screenshot that shows like an advertisement for, an exploit or someone saying, hey, I can breach whatever. The way that I'm always going to ask anybody that I'm reviewing about that is to say, okay, here's have someone write out the logic of what you're saying, which is to say, okay, you're saying X, going to work backwards from what you provided. So let's say I have a screenshot of an advertisement for someone who says that they can exploit a number of popular software. Whoop, at the bottom, you said someone has an exploit for Office 365. Well, all right, there's a big old missing middle there, which is either they've directly mentioned Office 365 or they've said something like, this exploit works against the top, 5 vendors for, identity and access management or general platform and directory, whatever that is, right? There has to be that middle that translates the piece of evidence that you have into an assessment of that evidence, because many people will do evidence conclusion. That's not how analysis works. It's evidence, meaning of evidence, or the way that evidence applies to X other aspect or set of aspects. Therefore, set of aspects is something I'm comfortable talking about. And this applies across very specific technical indicators all the way to general broad stuff. So someone might say, here's a great example that you see all the time, right? Ransomware is likely to continue as a major form of threat activity. That's interesting. Your piece of evidence is the Conti ransomware group just went after the government of Costa Rica. Okay, well, I need to see a missing middle there, which is the targeting of a government means that ransomware is likely to continue. That doesn't follow, right? There's not a compute there that those two things immediately go together. So you have to be fairly strict with yourself about how does any of the pieces of evidence I'm seeing, what other aspect am I adding into that assessment that has to have been associated directly with that piece of evidence prior to me getting there? So as you're doing open source intelligence and you're finding a whole bunch of evidence, whatever your assessment is, it has to pass that sniff test of that missing middle. It has to pass the test of A to B to B to C, right? And many people are quite accurate in their conclusions from evidence, but they're not good at explaining why that piece of evidence led to that conclusion. You can be 100% right and still be completely wrong in the way that you're presenting the analysis. Right. So, you need to pay attention to that.
I think that brings up another good point, which is it also depends on what kind of work you're doing. David brought up doing legal investigations and dealing with evidence. I worked as a private investigator, and a lot of the reports that I created were very fact-based. I wasn't creating a lot of assessments. I wasn't speculating about anything, because that's just going to be turned right back on me in court. That's completely different than doing, say, a risk assessment for a corporation and doing a lot more kind of what could happen if, what are the threats out there, that sort of stuff. So I think it's important also to keep in mind, what is my goal here? How deep into actual analysis and assessment do we want to go compared to how close to the actual evidence do we just sort of want to report? And again, there's a lot of people doing OSINT for different reasons, and some of them have a heavier intelligence analysis component than others.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important when you write a report that you just stick to showing your investigative crumb path, uh, but also showing your, or at least having a copy of your thought processes during your investigation. Because I've had numerous occasions that, based upon my initial research question, I started searching and collected data, and I came to a certain point where I came, let's say, on a intersection that, based upon the information that I now had and the preliminary analysis that I did, I decided to go left. I could have gone straight forward or right, but I made a decision to go left. And with that, I found new evidence that helped me find the answer to the research question. But still, I didn't go straight forward and I didn't go right. But it should at least be in my report, because if there is an additional need or a question, at least now someone knows that we could have taken a right turn and maybe found different information that let someone free or something else.
So, David, I got a question for you. Have you found there are any kind of things that you might consider to be somewhat non-traditional for technology, like a book or a resource that you felt really helped you with your analysis, like something that you really found to say, hey, this helped me think about things in a more structured way to kind of address the shortcomings you talked about in terms of making the logical flow?
Well, I'm gonna show my cards a little here for some history. I have an English degree.
Okay.
And I'd say that this is super far afield, but I'd say that getting any insight into like in-depth literary theory and analysis is a great way of getting a sense of the very specific and logical questions that you have to answer when you're doing a piece of analysis. Literary theory is so unbelievably nuanced and is a crowded field for how people interpret information that you're going to find that there's a lot of different approaches and techniques and ways of looking at the information that are just so completely outside of how you might do it on a first blush. So that for me as background has been super useful for just going into any question or any intelligence investigation and saying, I'm looking at this based on this key set of indicators that I think is relevant. There's probably, like, hiding behind a bush somewhere, some entirely other way of looking at this information that's going to put it into a completely different context. So I found that to be relevant to my own career. The other thing that I'd say too, and this isn't necessarily a book, but one of the things that's very helpful is getting experience with the items under your domain in a completely non-analytical context. So if you are working with, either, OSINT for surveillance data, it might be worthwhile, looking into books about just general geography, right? That don't have anything necessarily immediately to do with the stuff that you're looking at, but gives you a sense of what are some of the difficulties associated with the field that I'm interested in. I'd always do something like that. And as a very, very general category for that, I'd say if you don't know anything about X topic, and you can investigate yourself pretty well for all the topics that you don't really understand or don't know about, read as widely as possible. Like, what you need to do to read or to be trained up in the stuff that's relevant to your field or the stuff that you're interested in. Always make sure you're reading stuff that you're not interested in, because guaranteed there's going to be some application, either in terms of how the author is looking at information or what that information is, that's going to be useful down the road as additional context.
Oh, that's fantastic.
This literally reminds me of a book I was tipped by Michael Hoffman recently about visual thinking and analysis. And basically, that is a book on how the human mind works. So sometimes you'll see a picture and you can ask 10 people, what do you see? And they all see something different. So that really made me aware of that. Hey, it's so important to get out of your comfort zone and start reading up on topics that you are not aware of or do not feel comfortable with. That really, I really appreciate that. Thank you.
And on the analytical side, I was just going to say, when I was making my transition from being a private investigator, again, a lot of evidence-based, what are the facts kind of work into information security, books like Richard Hoyer's Psychology of Intelligence Analysis, things like that. Just like, how do people think? What are biases? Just understand some of the thought processes of yourself and others can be really helpful. I think it's time to wrap up. David, go ahead.
So just kind of we're going to throw in our book recommendations here. For me, actually, because I've mentioned visualization a couple of times, that's been something we're looking at. So if you've not seen the work of Tuft on displaying information, the visual display of quantitative information is one of his early works. Very interesting way of thinking about data.
Awesome. David Carver, any final words? Anything that you want to say before we wrap it up?
I mean, I've mentioned this before. It's really, I was thinking about this prior to jumping on, that the techniques and the tactics that we use when we're doing analysis should all flow out of some fairly fundamental principles. And the most important principle for any technique, like, maybe we're using X technique, maybe we're using X tactic, maybe we're doing something as simple as frowning when we're looking at a piece of evidence. But to my mind, the core virtue of any analyst is humility, because there is always something that you don't know. There's always a way that you're looking at things in the wrong way. And there's always stuff that other people know better than you or can look at better than you. And if you go into every day as an analyst saying, I'm going to be confident based on my knowledge of the material, but I'm always willing to step back and say I might be wrong for any reason, that's going to serve you incredibly well in every single investigation that you do. Yeah.
Fantastic. Anyone else?
Assume nothing, doubt everything.
I mean, yeah, right? You really can't go into investigations and doing intelligence work with a fixed idea in your mind, right? Like, I know everything. You're going to botch it. All right. Well, listen, thank you to everyone that joined us today on the stream. David Carver, thank you so much. This, I think, has been a really great discussion of a topic that is not addressed enough in the OSINT world. And my co-authors, David and Nico, thanks as well. We'll see you again